The grand dining hall of the luxury restaurant glowed with golden lights as the richest guests in the city gathered to witness a historic moment, the signing of a contract that promised to make billionaire Richard Grant even more powerful than before. And as crystal glasses clinked and laughter filled the air, all eyes turned toward the tall man seated at the center table with the glossy folder before him, his pen poised in his hand, ready to mark his name on the papers that would secure billions. But just as silence fell for the final flourish, a soft, trembling voice broke through the air, stopping everyone cold. "Sir, don't sign that," and every head snapped in the direction of the young black waitress, Maya, who stood frozen with the tray clutched against her chest, her wide eyes betraying fear yet burning with a spark of desperate courage. And for a moment, the room seemed to forget its elegance as whispers spread like wildfire, people asking if they had heard correctly, a waitress daring to interrupt a billionaire at such a critical moment, and Mr. Grant slowly raised his eyes, narrowing them as his hand hovered above the paper, his jaw tightening at the audacity of the girl. For he was a man who commanded respect in every room he entered, and no one had ever spoken to him in such a manner. Yet there she was, trembling but refusing to lower her gaze, and the silence grew heavy until one of the guests burst into laughter, mocking her words, calling her foolish for thinking she had any place in a room filled with lawyers, businessmen, and millionaires. And others quickly joined, ridiculing her for her bold interruption, saying she should be fired instantly. Yet Maya did not move, her fingers gripping the tray so hard her knuckles turned white. But her voice rose again, steadier this time. "Please, sir, don't sign. It is not what you think." And her words, though simple, carried a weight that made Mr. Grant pause, his sharp eyes scanning her face, searching for the reason behind such bravery. And the laughter around the room suddenly felt shallow against the intensity of that moment, for she was not pleading for herself but for him. And that struck something deep within him, though he did not show it, instead, leaning back in his chair, with controlled calmness, his voice low but cutting through the air. "And why, exactly, should I listen to you?" And the crowd gasped at the fact that he had even acknowledged her. But he did not break eye contact with her, waiting for her answer. And Maya's heart pounded against her ribs so loud she thought everyone could hear it, her mind racing with the risk she was taking, because with a single order she could be thrown out, humiliated, and perhaps even arrested for disrupting such an important event. Yet she drew a breath and spoke with the courage she barely felt. "Because you are about to be trapped, and if you sign those papers, you will lose everything you built." And the room erupted in chaos as guests jeered, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering nervously at the strength of her claim. And one of the lawyers immediately stood, his face red with anger, demanding she be removed at once, insisting she had no knowledge of the contract and was merely trying to cause a scene. But still Mr. Grant did not order her gone. Instead, he tapped the table lightly, his expression unreadable, the faintest shadow of doubt flickering across his mind. For in all his years of business he had learned to respect instinct, and something about her voice, about the way she refused to back down, even as everyone mocked her, felt different. And so he raised his hand, silencing the shouts, and said in a calm yet commanding tone, "Let her speak." And the words fell, like thunder, silencing the entire room, the laughter dying instantly, the lawyers stiffening with unease, the investors shifting uncomfortably. For this was not the reaction they had expected, and Maya blinked in shock, her throat tightening. But she steadied herself, knowing this was her only chance to save him from a mistake she knew would cost him dearly, though she could see the rage in the eyes of those who wanted her silenced. And as she stood there under the heavy gaze of the most powerful man in the city, her next words would decide not only her fate but possibly his as well. And the weight of that truth pressed down on her as the golden chandeliers sparkled above, casting long shadows across the room, making her feel as though the world had stopped spinning, waiting for her to reveal why she had dared to say the unthinkable. The room felt as though it had shrunk to half its size when billionaire Richard Grant's commanding voice allowed Maya to speak. And yet her throat tightened, as if invisible hands tried to choke the words out of her, every eye in the hall piercing into her like arrows, half filled with amusement, half with anger, and none with kindness, except perhaps the man whose fortune hung on the stroke of a pen. And though he showed no expression, Maya could sense he was listening, truly listening, which gave her trembling courage, a fragile thread to hold on to. But the silence was unbearable, the whispers like 1,000 little knives slicing her resolve, and finally she forced her lips to move, her voice thin but clear. "That contract is not what it seems. The people behind it want to take everything you own." And the boldness of her words rippled across the tables like thunder, shocking even the servers who froze with trays midair, while the suited lawyers rushed forward, their faces pale and furious, calling her a liar, accusing her of seeking attention, demanding Mr. Grant to dismiss her. Yet he remained still, his fingers steepled under his chin, eyes sharp and cold as steel, weighing her every word with the seriousness of a judge. And that unsettled the room even more, for they knew he was a man who rarely wasted time on nonsense. But something about her made him wait, though he himself could not explain why. Perhaps it was the raw honesty in her trembling tone, or the way she had nothing to gain and everything to lose by standing against them. And in that tense silence, Maya took another shaky step forward, clutching the tray so tightly it shook in her hands. "I have seen the documents," she whispered, her eyes darting toward one of the lawyers. "I saw the changes they hid, the words they twisted, the fine print that would strip you of your empire." And gasps rang out as though she had uttered the most dangerous secret in the world. For now, it was not just a warning but an accusation, a direct strike against the powerful men sitting at the table. And their fury was clear, one slamming his hand on the table, threatening to call security, another shouting that she was a lowly waitress making up lies to protect herself from being fired. But Maya did not waver this time, her heart hammering with a strength she didn't know she had, her voice firmer now. "I don't care if you throw me out, but if you sign that paper tonight, you will lose your name, your company, everything your family built, and you will not even see it until it's too late." And her words fell into the hall like stones into a still pond, creating ripples of unease that spread through even the guests who had mocked her moments ago. For though they had laughed at first, the fire in her tone now forced them to wonder if there was truth behind it. And still Richard Grant remained motionless, studying her face as if trying to peel away the surface to see her soul, until finally he turned his eyes to the lawyers, his voice low and commanding. "Explain." And the men exchanged nervous glances, their polished confidence cracking as sweat lined their foreheads, each fumbling with rehearsed words about trust, opportunity, and guaranteed success. But their voices no longer carried the certainty they had only minutes ago, and Maya saw it. Richard saw it too, that flicker of hesitation, that shadow of fear when they realized their scheme might be unraveling under the gaze of the man they sought to deceive. And as the air grew heavier, the guests leaned closer, their curiosity piqued, their laughter silenced, waiting for what would happen next, for the billionaire's decision now hung between two fragile truths, one spoken by a trembling waitress who had no reason to lie, and the other defended by men with every reason to hide. And in that collision of power and honesty, the room seemed to hold its breath, knowing that whatever Richard Grant chose in the next few moments would either ruin him or reveal the biggest betrayal of his life. The hall seemed frozen in time, as Richard Grant's piercing eyes moved slowly from the shaken lawyers to the trembling young waitress who stood before him, with a tray clutched to her chest. And though her body trembled, there was a quiet fire in her gaze that dared to hold his hand. And in that instant the billionaire sensed she was not speaking from foolishness or desperation, but from something deeper, something that even his years of business cunning could not ignore. So with a firm tone that cut through the suffocating silence, he ordered the lawyers to bring the documents forward, his words leaving no room for argument, and the shuffle of papers being laid on the polished oak table was the only sound echoing in the vast room. But Maya's eyes widened when she saw the very folder she had glimpsed earlier while clearing tables, the one she had accidentally seen open in the kitchen where one of the men had been carelessly whispering about hidden clauses. And her pulse quickened as Richard's eyes scanned the pages with the swiftness of a man who had read thousands of contracts in his lifetime. Yet as his brows furrowed and his lips pressed into a thin line, the air grew colder, for even he began to see something that did not align with the promises he had been given. And the lawyers, sensing danger, spoke quickly, filling the air with jargon, insisting it was a minor adjustment, a technicality that meant nothing in the grand scheme. But Maya's voice, though quiet, cut through their noise with more force than a shout. "Look at page 14, she whispered, her words trembling yet sharp. And Richard, almost without thinking, turned to the page, his finger sliding down the lines until it landed on the clause that twisted his stomach, a hidden condition that would shift controlling power of his company into the hands of an unknown shell corporation, effectively stripping him of his empire without him even realizing until the ink had dried. And gasps filled the hall as he read it aloud, his voice low but filled with venom. And suddenly, all eyes turned to the lawyers whose faces had drained of color, their well-practiced smiles breaking apart into fragments of fear. And Richard rose slowly from his chair, the towering presence of a man who built his wealth through steel nerves and sharp instincts, and he demanded, his voice echoing like thunder, "Who inserted this clause?" But no one spoke, for the guilty knew silence was safer than words. Yet their shifting eyes betrayed them, and the audience of investors and guests, once amused by the interruption of a waitress, now leaned forward with horrified fascination, for they realized they were witnessing the unmasking of betrayal at the highest level, a battle of truth against greed unfolding before their eyes. And Maya, though her knees trembled, stood straighter now, her courage fueled by the fact that her warning had proven real. Yet she braced herself for the storm that might follow, because powerful men rarely accepted being exposed by someone they deemed insignificant. And as the tension thickened like smoke, Richard turned to Maya, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a man who needed answers. "How did you know this?" And in that moment, every head turned again, waiting for her response, some doubting her, others beginning to believe she was the only honest soul in the room. And Maya took a deep breath, recalling the night she had been cleaning near the kitchen when she overheard the hushed whispers of two men, words about ownership and deception slipping from their careless lips, and when she had looked at the papers they left behind, curiosity had shown her the truth that she could not unsee, and though fear had clawed at her since then, she could not let a man lose everything without at least trying to warn him. So she told the story now in front of all, her voice no longer shaking but strong, and when she finished, the room was silent again, though not with disbelief, but with a growing storm of realization, and Richard, after a long moment, gave her the smallest nod, one that carried more weight than applause, for in that nod was acknowledgment that she had saved him from ruin, and in that instant the revelation shattered the false walls of loyalty that had surrounded him for years, exposing the truth of betrayal, not just on paper but in the very faces of the men he had once trusted. And the hall, still hushed, waited to see what the billionaire would do next, for the balance of power had shifted, not by wealth or influence, but by the courage of a young woman who had dared to speak when silence would have been safer. The silence in the grand hall, after the shocking revelation, felt heavier than stone, and while everyone's eyes darted from Richard to Maya to the trembling lawyers, the billionaire felt something stirred deep inside his chest, something more powerful than anger, and it was the realization that this was not just about business or money but about trust, integrity, and the test of his own heart. For here he stood with the power to crush those who betrayed him and dismiss the waitress who dared to step into a world far above her own. Yet he also knew that power without wisdom was dangerous, so he forced himself to remain calm even as his pulse hammered against his ribs, and his gaze locked on Maya with a question unspoken but clear. Why had she risked everything, her job, her safety, perhaps even her future, to speak for him, a man she barely knew? And Maya, though nervous, did not lower her head, for in her heart she felt that silence in the face of wrong was the same as betrayal, and the courage she had drawn from within made her stand tall now. But this only deepened the tension as whispers moved like a wave across the hall, some doubting her intentions, some calling her brave, and some suspecting she was part of a greater scheme. And Richard, sensing the growing storm, raised his hand, silencing the crowd, and declared that the truth must come out fully, so he demanded an investigation right there, calling for the head of security to retrieve the digital copies of the contract and trace every alteration. And while the security team rushed to obey, the guilty lawyers exchanged desperate glances, one even attempting to slip quietly out of the room, but the guards blocked the door, their presence turning the hall into a courtroom, and the weight of judgment grew heavier by the second. Yet the test was not only for the traitors but also for Richard himself, for as he looked around the room, he realized how many faces he had trusted were now painted with suspicion, and it forced him to ask whether wealth had blinded him to the true character of those closest to him. And while that question gnawed at him, his eyes kept drifting back to Maya, the young woman whose honesty cut sharper than any blade, and he wondered if fate had placed her in his path for a reason far greater than this night. But before he could dwell too deeply, the head of security returned with evidence that confirmed Maya's claim. Every hidden line, every secret condition traced back to one of the men who had once been Richard's most trusted advisor, and the room erupted in gasps, the guilty advisor falling to his knees in a desperate plea. But Richard's face showed no mercy now, for betrayal had no excuse. Yet when he opened his mouth to speak judgment, he paused, for his heart wrestled with the weight of what this meant, and he thought of all the years of loyalty that had led to this single act of treachery, and for a moment, he almost faltered, for he was a man who built empires but also a man who had lost people he loved because of pride and anger. And Maya's steady gaze reminded him that sometimes strength was not in striking back but in choosing the higher path. And so, after a long silence that felt like an eternity, Richard declared that justice would be served not by violence or rage but by law and truth, stripping the betrayer of his power and position, handing over evidence to authorities, and making it clear that deceit had no place in his empire. And as the guards dragged the fallen man away, the crowd murmured with awe at the billionaire's restraint. But the test was not over, for now, all eyes turned once again to Maya, and Richard, his voice softer but still commanding, asked her what she wanted as a reward for her bravery, offering her wealth, security, or any position she wished. Yet Maya, after a long pause, shook her head and said she wanted nothing but fairness, a world where truth was not silenced and people like her, unseen and unheard, were given a chance. And her words struck the hall with more force than any revelation, for they carried the purity of a heart untainted by greed, and Richard felt a lump form in his throat, for he realized this young woman had not only saved his fortune but had also reminded him of something. He had long forgotten that humanity was more valuable than all the gold in the world, and so, the test of his heart was complete, for he saw in her the reflection of his own better self. And though he did not speak it aloud, he knew that this night had changed the course of his life forever. And the suspense in the hall shifted from fear of betrayal to wonder of what would come next. For the billionaire's future was no longer just about his empire, but but about the choices he would make after having his heart tested and found true in the most unexpected of ways. The night had ended with gasps, accusations, and the shocking downfall of those Richard once trusted, but as the sun began to rise, spilling golden light through the glass walls of his mansion, a new day carried with it the weight of change, and Richard, who had spent much of the night pacing his study in silence, understood that his world could never return to what it once was, for the events of that evening had opened his eyes to truths he could no longer ignore, and while the betrayal cut deep, the courage of Maya, the young waitress who had risked everything, left him with a sense of clarity he had not felt in years, and so, as morning came, he made his way to the dining hall where his staff waited nervously, uncertain of what would happen next, and among them stood Maya. Her head bowed slightly, though her heart still carried the strength of what she had done, and when Richard's eyes fell upon her, the entire room fell into silence, for it was clear that something important was about to be spoken, and he cleared his throat before announcing that the empire he had built was no longer safe in the hands of those who sought only greed, and that from this day forward, he would restructure his company, placing honesty above power, transparency above wealth, and people above profit, and his words shocked everyone present, for they had never seen a man of his stature speak with such humility, but it was Maya's face he kept returning to, as though her quiet bravery had become the compass guiding his steps, and then, with a calm yet firm voice, he revealed his next decision, one that would send ripples through every life in that room. He offered Maya a position not of servitude but of trust, to work by his side as an advisor, not because of her education or her background but because she had proven what no degree or title could, that she valued truth above all. And the gasps that followed were mixed with disbelief and awe. For how could a waitress, a girl who had once been invisible in the eyes of the wealthy, suddenly be lifted into the inner circle of the most powerful man in the room? But Richard silenced the whispers with a single gesture, declaring that courage must be rewarded if the world was ever to change, and Maya, though stunned, found her voice trembling as she asked why he would do such a thing, to which he simply replied that she reminded him of who he once wanted to be, and that without people like her, his empire had no soul. And though his words brought tears to her eyes, she hesitated, unsure if she could carry such a responsibility, but as she looked around at the staff, the businessmen, and even the loyal guards who had watched everything unfold, she saw respect in their faces, respect she had never been given before. And in that moment, she realized that saying yes was not only for herself but for everyone who had ever been silenced or overlooked, and so she accepted, her voice soft but steady, and with that single choice, the atmosphere shifted, as though the dawn itself had broken inside the mansion, and Richard, feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace, turned his gaze to the horizon, where the sun climbed higher, knowing that this was not the end of his story but the beginning of something new. For the empire he once ruled alone would now be guided by a conscience far purer than his own, and, though challenges lay ahead, the knowledge that truth had triumphed gave him strength, while Maya, walking out of that hall for the first time, as more than just a waitress, felt her own future unfolding like a book yet unwritten, filled with pages of hope and possibility. And so the new dawn came, not only for Richard and Maya, but for everyone who had witnessed the events of that fateful night, a reminder that courage can rise from the most unexpected places, and that when truth shines, even the darkest rooms cannot stay in shadow forever.